Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
In the 1979 UK general election, Margaret Thatcher, leader of the Conservative Party, mainstreamed once minor viewpoints and created a sentiment of British isolationism in the UK. Despite many contributing factors, two main ideas Thatcher mainstreamed drove this rhetoric: anti-immigration and Euroscepticism. During her prime minister years, Thatcher put her responsibility to voter desires over basic human rights of immigrants. Even after Thatcher left office in 1990, her isolationist legacy endured as the UK slowed its integration with Europe, and when a second referendum on UK membership was held, the nation exercised its rights within Europe and voted to leave the European Union with Brexit. Since the end of World War II, Europe had slowly become more united. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome created a centralized power called the European Economic Community. Initially, 6 member nations were a part of it, but quickly, more European states joined in. In 1973, the United Kingdom joined. Just 2 years later, however, a referendum was held in the UK. The question: do you think that the United Kingdom should stay in the European Economic Community? The results were conclusive, as over 65% voted to remain, with less than 35% voting to leave. These results painted a pretty clear picture. England was standing with Europe, and so were the politicians. Then Conservative leader Margaret Thatcher and her party campaigned to remain, as the Liberal Labours were divided on the issue. This consensus across the board would change over the years, however, and one person had a huge role to play. 4 years after the referendum of '75, the UK was holding a general election to elect members of Parliament. During the campaigning period, Thatcher made many bold decisions. While many issues were discussed by both parties, one issue repeatedly came up on the Conservative side: immigration. During this period, racial tensions in the UK were high as citizens became resentful of immigrants taking up vital housing and resources, as multiculturalism was being put under fire.
There are far too many immigrants in this country.
We do not have sufficient houses, jobs and schools for our own people, let alone immigrants.
Thatcher felt the concerns of the citizens and ultimately campaigned on their immigration concerns.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers.
Many on the left accused Thatcher of using racist rhetoric to seemingly win over voters.
I think Mrs. Thatcher's remarks are very much racist.
But it worked. Previously, Britain didn't feel as strongly on these views. Before the 1979 election, anti-immigrant views were reserved for extreme far-right groups such as the National Front.
She is talking racialist language, and she is making the National Front more respectable in the eyes of the British people.
During the election, Thatcher enabled extreme right views and thus changed the rhetoric in England while mainstreaming a once extreme and shunned view. Because Thatcher carried out her responsibility to voter desires, the Conservatives won the election, and Britain elected its first female prime minister, thus giving Thatcher the platform to spread her British isolationist rhetoric. There were, however, 2 parts to this. For Thatcher, it started with the acceptance and promotion of anti-immigration, cultivating an environment primed for racial tensions to spark. Early into Thatcher's years as Prime Minister, it was clear that tension between colored immigrants and the police were growing. Government-backed sus laws gave police unseen power to stop and search people, often with little to no evidence of any wrongdoing, as young blacks became frequent victims. With immigrant groups as a whole being denied basic rights, the responsibility of government is to protect civil liberties, but in this case, Thatcher's government led to its erosion for certain groups. These growing tensions ignited widespread racial tension between blacks and the police. For days, young people of color disrupted the peace in Britain, throwing gas bombs and stones at the police. Fed up with their denial of basic human rights, they rioted. Police numbers increased as they quelled the disturbances. Still, racial tensions continued for years with an increase in racist acts and attacks. Eventually, genuine talks about repatriation began from the right. A nationalist, anti-immigrant sentiment came to the forefront in the UK as Thatcher's government put forth laws such as the British Nationality Act, which created classes of citizens and removed birthright citizenship, making it more difficult for immigrants to settle in the UK. The left condemned the law, marking it racist as immigrants began feeling more alienated in their new country. No matter what anyone thought, however, the truth remained. Thatcher was transforming the sentiment in England and making an extreme rhetoric the new norm. However, this was just one piece of her British isolationism puzzle. The other piece was Britain's ever-changing view of its existence in Europe. Swiftly, the Conservative Party was becoming a Eurosceptic party. Less than a decade before, during the 1975 referendum, Thatcher and the Conservatives supported remaining a part of the European Economic Community, or EEC. In the 1980s, under Thatcher, the party began major reforms. No longer was it a pro-European party. Relations with the EEC soured as Thatcher became more resentful of EEC members making decisions that affected Britain. As Prime Minister, she constantly pushed for independence and sovereignty of nations within the EEC at a time when Eurocentricity was growing. For example, she opted the UK out of the Schengen Agreement, which was signed by most EEC nations to dismantle border control and allow for the free movement of people between Schengen nations. Undoubtedly, Britain's vision for Europe diverged from the rest of the EEC. After years of supporting the European Economic Community, it was clear that the Conservatives were drifting away. And by the late 80s, they were firmly Eurosceptic.
Europe will be stronger precisely because it has France as France, Spain as Spain, Britain as Britain, each with its own customs, traditions, and identity. It would be folly to try to fit them into some sort of identikit European personality. It is ironic that just when those countries, such as the Soviet Union, which have tried to run everything from the center, are learning that success depends on dispersing power and decisions away from the center, there are some in the community who seem to want to move in the opposite direction.
In just a decade, Margaret Thatcher had reimagined what it meant to be British. By promoting anti-immigration, both through words and action, she alienated immigrants from the rest of the nation. And by denouncing the EEC for its problems while pushing for nations to have more independence, she created a Eurosceptic culture in the UK. And when paired with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, British nationalism and isolationism were at the fore, as the nation was literally and figuratively on an island of its own. Towards the end of Thatcher's years as Prime Minister and after, the EEC aimed for deeper integration, including the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which established a single European currency. While the UK stayed in the now EU, it opted out of the single currency plan, driven by Thatcher-era Euroscepticism.
The fact is, they have no competence on money, no competence on the economy, so yes, the right honourable gentleman would be glad to hand it all over. But what is the point in trying to get elected to Parliament only to hand over your sterling and to hand over the powers of this House to Europe?
Over time, a political divide grew. The left favoured integration with Europe while the right opposed it. Eventually, these beliefs clashed when the UK held yet another referendum on British membership in the European Union, as Prime Minister David Cameron felt he had a responsibility to leave it to the people and let them exercise their democratic rights. Unlike the consensus of 1975, the 2016 referendum reflected decades of shifting rhetoric, particularly around immigration and sovereignty, with a third of voters driven by border concerns. Through her promotion of anti-immigrant, Eurosceptic, and isolationist views, Thatcher reshaped not just policy, but the very meaning of rights and who held them. From race riots to referendums, Thatcher's Britain was one where rights were exercised, rights were denied, and the responsibility of leadership left a lasting mark on British society, culminating in one of the biggest geopolitical turning points: Britain exercising its right to leave the EU with Brexit.
The other major story tonight, the global aftershocks after that vote in Britain deciding to leave the European Union, to go it alone. And the faces in Britain, those who thought there was no way this could happen. Then another